Hello and welcome to this episode of the Road to Rec League podcast. I'm Callum and today we're going to be talking about pre-season Winnipeg Jets and what this podcast will be all about. Okay, so we may as well start with what's this podcast all about. So I'm a UK-based hockey fan and I've only really been following the sport for the last couple of years. Probably 2.5 at this point now. And I really got into it through following the Winnipeg Jets. Long story short, a band I liked is from Winnipeg. They mentioned the band they mentioned the team in a song, and I kind of fell into the sport that way. I've been really invested in it, really enjoying learning about the sport, watching it. I genuinely can't compare any other sport in terms of a viewing experience to hockey. It's just far and away the most exciting sport to watch. Certainly ones that are regularly televised anyway. And so I've really thrown myself in. Now that's included a couple of different levels. One is my Jets fandom, which is probably a little unusual. So last year I stayed up and watched all 95 games, pre-season, post-season and regular season. I made sure I caught at least a few minutes of every single one live. Most of them, I would say 90+%, I watched start to finish live. So found myself awake between the hours of 12 and 3 quite often. And those Western starts were less than ideal. Sort of puck drop at 3 o'clock in the morning over here. But I was really committed and I wanted to sort of really take in as much as possible. It felt like last season was a really special season to get involved in. It's also taken me to Winnipeg twice. I've met some amazing people. I got to be there for game one of the Whiteout last season, which was just a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Although hopefully not. Fingers crossed they keep finding their way back and I keep finding my way back there. But genuinely, it's been such a cool thing to get invested in. And that's a really big part of why I wanted to do this. And really being inspired by that trip and the Canadian culture of ice hockey, I suppose, made me question how I was getting involved in it and if there was anything more I could do for myself. And so I, at the start of this year, began learning to skate. I'd never really done it at all as a child or adult prior. I'm in my late 20s, so it's starting something new at an age where it takes a little bit longer to learn these things, but that's okay. So I'd stepped onto the ice for the first time in January. Was on and off skating because of the trips out to Winnipeg and both of them, which was pretty amazing, obviously, but that did stunt my development. And in the last 5-6 weeks, I've actually started to do adult learn to play hockey sessions. And it's been amazing. I've been actually blogging the journey, which is really mid-2000s, but hence why maybe a slight transition into doing this as well. Something a little bit more 21st century, or I suppose 21st century, but a little bit more updated, a little bit newer. And also in some ways a little bit easier, because if there's one thing I can do, it's chat rubbish. So I've really thrown myself into that, and not just on the I'll turn up and learn to play once a week, but getting out and skating as much as I can. Obviously, holding down a job, adult life and such means that I can't do that, twice a day, every day. But on top of that, trying to maximize, I guess, me physically, right? So that means going and eating better, doing other physical activity to get fitter, working on strength and conditioning, trying to work the muscles that I'll be using in hockey. So I've really thrown myself all in for the last 5-6 weeks. Again, through the blog, I'll probably, wherever I'm distributing this, I'll keep a link to that as well, because they kind of go hand in hand. So I kind of thought it'd be fun to start a podcast to, A, talk about my Jets fandom. The season's, right around the corner. It's going to be really fun topics this year, I think. It's going to be something slightly different. And after a cracking regular season last year and a slightly disappointing playoffs, but at the end of the day, a step forward from the year before. With that in the rearview mirror and change in the sort of ahead, I think that's going to be quite an exciting season to talk about. But over and above that, I want to talk about my learning process. I am throwing myself into something new as an adult in their late 20s, turning 30. So I'm taking on something new. I'm throwing myself into it. What can I share? Is there anything that I can offer to people who have never done something like this before? Can I learn from a community of listeners potentially? Can we get guests on to talk about specific things, whether that be nutrition or whether that be getting into specific hockey analytics as a viewer or something like that? So I just feel like there's such a cool scope for introducing either new people to hockey or, let's say, traditionalists to a slightly different way of looking at it through the eyes of someone who's coming at this sort of head on, but for the first time in their life. So that's kind of the broad the broad brushstrokes of what I hope this Road to Rec League podcast will be all about. I'm going to keep it quite short form as well, because at the end of the day, I think there's enough hour to 2 hour podcasts out there around hockey, sports in general. And I quite like the idea of having that slightly shorter, maybe 20, 30-minute episodes. I'll pick a subject. We'll maybe do a bit of a weekly review of the Jets games, talk a bit about the results, my level of optimism or not, as the case might be. Maybe delve into some specific elements of games as well. I'd really like to do a little segment around having like a bit of a notebook that I just jot a few things down during games and pick out some themes for the week. So if I try and understand some actual schemes, some tactical schemes used on the ice, or break down a power play or something and have a go at that, and then obviously you can get some feedback around, am I way off the mark? Am I missing something? Or have I uncovered something that's quite common or quite popular? Or, I guess learning organically and then checking back with the community, I think can be really, really fun. And then on top of that, obviously, again, talking about my jump into it. So without rambling too much more, because like I said, the point is to keep this pretty short form. That's kind of it for the intro to the session. Like I said in the actual intro of the podcast, going to jump into my pre-season review for the Winnipeg Jets. So the season is a few weeks away in the grand scheme of things. Summer is starting to tail off. It's a little bit colder outside. I know I can't quite say that in the same context of those in Winnipeg who follow the Jets, but it's, I don't know, maybe 10, 12 degrees. I did have to put the heating on this morning just to knock the chill out of the house. But we're doing okay, broadly. There's still sunshine. Actually, rare, though that might be, because we've had rain pretty much every day for every week for the last few weeks, but that's okay too. That's just the nature of the transitional period in seasons in the UK. It does mean less inline skating, but I'm sure I'll get over it. So, with the hockey season a couple of weeks away, or a few weeks away, we've got obviously the pre-season before that, and some prospect tournaments and stuff like that. I just wanted to, I guess, before the puck is dropped once, have a bit of a chat about what's to come for the Jets in from my perspective, and how do I think this year is going to be different, maybe touch on the things I'm looking forward to, the things I'm excited about, the things I may be a bit more pessimistic about, and we can set the stall, because over the course of the year, every week, we can do then a bit of a review. How are they getting on? And what would be really lovely to do is maybe a couple of set points throughout the season, compare notes. What did I expect, or what were my questions at the start of the year, versus where are they now? How have they answered them? Because I do think there'll be change throughout the year, and we'll see how we go. So, with that in mind, I wanted to start with, I guess, maybe the more negative side of it, which is, I think if you look at the roster composition today, the actual lineups, on paper, slightly weaker. In my mind anyway. Losing Nikolai Ehlers, I think, is going to be felt this year. He's such a dynamic player, and his 5-on-5 stats in terms of like points per 60 or something, it's way up there among some of the best in the NHL. So I do think we'll feel a little bit of pain there. And I'm particularly interested to see how that influences the power play. Last year, the power play was such a really big component for the Jets' regular season success, that losing such a key character in that power play that took what was a middling to subpar power play the year before to something that was quite good. I mean, obviously, assistant coaches changed, schemes changed slightly. There was a lot more movement, but when you've got such a dynamic skater, having that movement, I guess, dovetailed really, really well with his skill set. So what are they going to lose by not having Fly on the roster? I'm genuinely fascinated. And how are they going to then approach replacing him, so to speak? Big air quotes around that, because obviously it's not a one-for-one. We haven't got the luxury of just bringing in a big name in free agency and plugging a gap. So how are they going to create the same offense, or ultimately have the same net result? Because it could be that they are maybe more defensively sound. How are they going to get that benefit back? I do think that would be a really interesting thing to address, whether that be through young players redefining the middle six, which we'll get onto in a bit, or ultimately accepting that that's going to be a gap, and we'll try and fill that gap at the trade deadline for the playoffs and just make sure we make the playoffs. So I touched on it for a second there. Utilization of the middle six. So I think this is going to be a really interesting year for that. I certainly hope it is. Last year, it felt like we had pretty set lines. The top line I still think will largely be the same. They were a high-scoring 5-on-5 top line, but they also played so many minutes together. I still think they're good. I still think it's a perfectly passable top line, personally. But maybe room for improvement, or perhaps there's an opportunity to spread the wealth a little bit. I don't think they necessarily will, so I want to just focus on that middle six. So a few things have changed. Obviously, we talked about losing Ehlers in just a few moments ago. No more Mason Appleton. Now, that one I probably won't cry over, but at the end of the day, you had this third line, this identity line of Niederreiter, Lowry, Appleton, and that would go out basically just as often as that top line. They were effectively the second line in terms of minutes. They just weren't that second scoring line. And I feel like with the moving on of Mason Appleton, there's an opportunity to restructure that middle six a little bit. Go away from having a checking line and a second scoring line to maybe just a couple of lines that can offer maybe a little bit more offense or some options or rotation, change. Maybe you could have better matchups against different opponents now because we're not getting so stuck in, the third line is always the same. It has the same function every game. Now, obviously, Lowry's coming back from an injury, so he won't be in there straight away. But let's assume, because I'm thinking of the whole season, you've got Low's in at 3C. Obviously, you're then looking at that second line. You're going, okay, well, we've got Taves, so he's going to probably slot in as 2C, you'd think, or that's certainly the aspiration. I mean, I'll touch again a bit more on Taves later because it's a bit of an unknown. But let's just assume that he pays off as planned, which is a 2C, basically. So you've got those two centres. You've got an array of different wingers in Perfetti, Niederreiter, Nyquist. You've got some of the young guns like Lambert and Chibrikov could step in. Who else have we got? We got Iafallo, Barron, although I think he'll probably be a C rather than a winger. And then obviously with Koepke and Pearson, you've got options basically. Now I think Koepke and Pearson are probably lower than the middle six, but I'm just saying we have options. We've got different choices. So how they compose those lines, I think, will be really, really interesting. And I'm actually quite excited. Oh, and of course we've got Vladdy as well still, so he will probably just shift to a wing position, I presume, or be a really luxury fourth line centre. So we'll see how they play that out. But I'm genuinely interested, and I think this is the first year for the last couple of years that there might be some shift or some change in that, which I think will be good. Something else that's been talked about probably for the last 2.5 years that I've been watching the Jets play is, probably more than it should as well, is the third defensive pair. Now, the reason I say that is we've got questions around waiver wire. So there is something like 9 defensemen signed on contracts who are basically eligible for waivers. So you're looking at the lower end of that. Logan Stanley, Ville Heinola. You've got who else we got in that little bracket down there? Colin Miller, Luke Shen, Hayden Fleury. Those kind of depth defensemen, if you like. And then just on the outside looking in, I suspect Elias Salmonson, who obviously is not waiver eligible, so he'll be fine. He can pass through waivers. But you've got Salmonson, who's probably in and around that kind of capability potentially. So who makes the cut and who doesn't? And I suspect personally that Ville will go or be put on waivers. Now, whether he gets claimed or not, I genuinely think that's a 50-50. I mean, you look at Chisholm was it last season or I think it was last season, maybe the season before, but Declan Chisholm got picked up off waivers, and I guess he's of a similar kind of stature, a similar kind of player-ish. Although Ville, I think, obviously carries that first round draft pick tag, so I suspect he gets maybe slightly more favouring him getting picked up. And then obviously you've got Stan, Shen, Miller fighting for and Fleury fighting for those bottom two spots. I'm nervous that they'll just take all 8D, and then that restricts the number of forwards you can have on the roster as well. Just just from actual numbers wise. And realistically, how do I put this? We don't really have a use for Logan Stanley anymore, I don't think. I think you've got Shen in there, who's a bit of a bruiser. You can play Flurry, who's more of a puck-moving left-sided D. We've got Miller, if you want two puck-moving defensemen, or two sensible defensemen. I think Stanley proved last year that he was bottom of the pile of those on the active roster. And frankly, probably shouldn't be playing the games/minutes he was playing in the NHL. I mean, there were some games where he was getting less than 10 minutes or something like that, 10, 11 minutes, which for a defenseman shows you're really sheltering them. So if you've got a big bruiser in there like Shen, what's the purpose of having 6'7" floating around in your third pair doing not an awful lot? So I suspect he's. I think they'll keep him. I wouldn't. There might even be some tradable value there because some people will take a punt on big. I just think that seems to carry weight in the NHL these days, just size, rather than how that size is utilized, or equally toughness, which I don't think is necessarily size relevant. Saw a fantastic clip of a chap whose name I can't remember, but he was like 5'5" or something, and he took down someone who looked twice his size. This was in the NHL, so I think it's a slightly overvalued attribute, and I would say he's not an overly tough guy. Pretty good at dancing though. So I think there are questions around how they'll deal with that, what ends up happening, what the outcomes are. Clearly someone's going to go through waivers or get traded. I'll be fascinated to see who it is. So back on to the topic of Jonathan Toews. I genuinely think this is going to be fascinating. I have never watched him play a game because I've only been following the last 2.5 years. So a lot of this is based on looking up old box stats and stuff, all the simple stats, and looking at some of his highlight reel stuff. I'm very aware that he is aged and he's been away from the game for a couple of years, and he's going to be at the very best, a bit rusty. But maybe it's just because I'm naturally optimistic. Do believe that he will end up fulfilling a role where he will be probably better than Vladdy would have been at 2C, as sort of in terms of like a net value, I guess. Seems like he's got a real drive. I mean, in some of the preseason or like Captain Skates interviews, he's been talking about this two-way responsibility, which is great. He used to be an absolute dominant force at face-offs, which has been something that the Jets have struggled with generally over the last couple of years. So that might be helpful. And I think he'll take away some of the, I guess, defensive pressure from the people around him. So is that going to enable the people on his wing to maybe be a little bit more offensive? Or is that even going to enable people on different lines to take on different roles, like I was saying earlier with this middle six philosophy? If he's a little bit more defensively capable and offensively, I suspect he'll probably outscore Vladdy. If he's really where I think the organization thinks he is, I think he'll do well. But it's such a mystery, and I actually think that's quite exciting. And until the puck drops and we see him and he's played 10 games and he's got his legs under him, I don't think we're going to know, but I'm optimistic. And I'm certainly not going to say he's going to come out and be Jonathan Toews of the early to mid 2010s, but I do think he's going to be better than when he left, and I think that's probably going to be good enough, or certainly good enough to make a positive difference to the team. So last season, a lot of players had career years. And that's like career highs in points, goals, etc. The question you've got to ask yourself is that sustainable? And who is going to be taking a step this year and who isn't? And I think that's really going to shape how this season goes for the Jets. So the likes of Perfetti, Velarde, really, really strong years last year. And they're still in their, what I would call growth phases, I guess. So I would love to see them continue that progression. And I have no reason to believe why it won't be in and around the same numbers, if not higher, which is great. You see Barron took a bit of a step when he moved into that center role. I think he became a little bit more of a force out on the ice, which is great. You've seen, again, good seasons from Scheifele, from Connor. Can they replicate that? And these are the questions you've got to ask as you go through this. Morrissey dropped off, I think, numbers-wise a little bit. So maybe he takes a step forward, picks up a couple more points this year. Obviously, not just about points. Sammy had a great year, Sandberg, as the second pair left side defenseman, and I genuinely think he's going to be such a rock this year, just playing tough minutes, eating up offensive sort of opportunities, if you like, from the opposition, and just making sure that nothing gets through. So I'm quite optimistic that he'll continue that progression. But you do just have to ask yourself, is that sustainable, and where the drop off is. The new addition of Nyquist or Nyquist, I don't know which way it is. I'll say it both ways to be sure. He's coming off of a slightly less than favourable season points wise, with a pretty terrible shooting percentage. But then you look at his year before and it was 70-something points or something. So is there going to be a happy medium for him? Does he take a step up from where he was last year? Now, I don't think he's going to cover off what Ehlers would have produced, but, is he going to be able to contribute more than he did last season for Nashville and for Minnesota when he was there? So I would expect so. And I guess that's the interesting piece around every year is we've got history to go off of. We've got stats for players that we understand from the past. A good off season can make a difference for some players. A good environment can make a difference for some players. So are the new additions going to be are they going to be welcome here? Of course, they'll be made to feel welcome, but are they going to blend? Are they going to fit with the schemes and the structures? And you hope they would. Are they going to fit with the city and the personalities? And I'd be optimistic that most additions to the Winnipeg Jets over the last couple of years have fit right in. So I think they actually consider this when they're going through their recruitment process, and I'm sure that they'll have picked people that can fit. And I suppose to go alongside that, you've then got the young guns, so the likes of Lambert, Chibrikov, potentially Salmonson, who have found themselves in the Moose for the last couple of years developing their game. How are they going to influence the NHL roster? How are they going to shape games themselves? And we've seen Chibrikov literally, scoring, I think he scored 2 goals in a few games last year, 1 goal on his first game the year before. So he's clearly going to be chippy and get stuck in. I mean, he's coming off of quite a significant injury from last year, but willing to get stuck in. And with Lambert, he's got a lot of flair, great skater, and was kind of held back a little bit by the quality of his line mates in the Moose last year. So what are we going to get from those young players and how are they going to complement the lineup? I think that would be really interesting if they get used at all, because being a team in win now mode and having that kind of risk aversion, if you like, odds are they probably stick to the slightly more veteran lineup. But I wouldn't be surprised if we saw cycling in a few young players here and there, and if one of them takes a spot, they take a spot. So what are my expectations for the Winnipeg Jets for this season? Well, I think we can start. If we start with the regular season, odds are it's a bit of a step back. Winning the President's Trophy last year, it felt like they were on such a run. The power play was clicking. Everything was going their way, which is great. And you've got to work hard to get that. I just think, again, going back to that question around sustainability and career years and stuff like that, there's 32 teams in the league. One can win it every year. Just like the Stanley Cup, it's hard to win those back-to-back. Now, I personally, coming from that kind of European sports background, place a bit of extra weight on the regular season, I think, over maybe some of my North American counterparts. And I think it shows that level of consistency and the, what's the right phrase? That kind of being a team built to win against multiple teams, playing your game, playing your structure. And I think the Jets do that quite well. So I do actually think they'll be all right in the regular season. I just don't see them winning the President's Trophy. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think if they can take more of an approach to the year as they build slowly towards the playoffs, they've got to get in, obviously, and I suspect they will. I think they'll be fighting for that second, third spot in the division still. I know some people suspect that there'll be a wild card. I think the same kind of things were said last year, so I'd always be a little bit cautious around saying it's going to be quite like that. Equally, it wouldn't surprise me if they were in and around wildcard sort of fighting spot, but I do think they'll be in that fight for home ice or third spot in the division, probably still with Dallas and Colorado, and then you've got obviously like your Minnesota, Utah, probably taking a step this year. So I think they'll be in and around that kind of area, but I do suspect that they will have a good crack at being in the playoffs this year. And I'm hoping that obviously the lessons learned from last year will give them a bit of a springboard. It is going to come down to how well they perform at the trade deadline. Last year was frankly a bit disappointing at the trade deadline. I know effort was made, but at the end of the day, you've got to have some plan Bs. You've got to be able to pivot. So when Brock Nelson says he's going somewhere else, you can't leave, like, was it £4-6 million worth of cap space just empty? I feel like that's a bit of a cardinal sin for a team that finished first in the regular season. You've got to try and go out and get a scoring winger at the very least, just so that you've got a bit more scoring depth. So, with that in mind, I think they missed an opportunity last year, and that's something they'll have to think about more this year. So the regular season, I think, will be pretty solid, pretty safe. I'm hoping anyway, and I do think it'll be a very, very similar kind of play. Solid defensively, keeping goals against down. I mean, a third consecutive Jennings would be unreal. I don't think they'll quite manage that, but that would be quite something. And I'd love to see how that could possibly go. So I think, yeah, regular season, they'll make the playoffs. In the playoffs, really comes down to how they utilize that trade deadline. They have to do better than last year, or I would expect a very similar outcome as last year, frankly. So we'll see. If they don't, then or if they don't make the playoffs, then I'd love to see how they handle their current roster and sort of trade deadline the other way around. I think that'd be utterly fascinating if the Jets were a sell team. I don't think they will be, but again, a good GM's probably going to have that in the back of his mind and be conscious of the pieces he can move and how he could make things work. Now, I think one of the most interesting topics for this year is going to be Kyle Connor and whether or not he stays, how much he is paid, and then what the Jets do after that. They must take some learnings from the Ehlers thing. I don't think you can let Kyle Connor walk. So that, I guess, there's an expectation. Bringing it back to the expectation subject, but expectations around Kyle Connor. I suspect he'll sign. The one thing I don't want to happen is see him walk to free agency. I think that is a massive miss if they do that, and probably a fireable offence, frankly. So we'll see how that goes. But my expectation is he'll probably re-sign, maybe slightly less than his market value. I don't want to put a number on it. I suspect it'll be 12 million plus with some of the conversations that are happening at the moment. Maybe 12 million. In that kind of ballpark. I think when I've seen online, some people talking about 10, I just can't see it being that low. And if it is, then Chevy is an excellent negotiator. So I guess that's a bit of a look ahead to this year, some expectations. I'm really curious to see how it goes, and I'm quite excited to be able to do this once a week, sit down, have a chat, 20 minutes, half an hour, talk a bit of Jets, talk a bit of my rec league progress, and generally chat shit about hockey, because frankly, that's fun, and who wouldn't want to do that? So thank you ever so much for listening. Until next time, enjoy the rest of your day.